So this evening's reading is Haggai chapter 2, verses 10 to 23. On the 24th day of the 9th month in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests what the law says. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? The priests answered, No. Then Haggai said, If a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Yes, the priests replied, it becomes defiled. Then Haggai said, So it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer, there is defiled. Now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. When anyone came to heap on 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from the 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall each by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is the word of the Lord.
Praise God. Great, thanks, Neil. One of the hardest books in the Bible to find, so if you didn't have the page number, we're on page 949, page 949. We can see straight through lousy excuses for bad behavior, can't we? There's a man who tried to get away with a speeding fine because he was late for a scouts meeting, as if helping with the scouts group excuses reckless driving. Or think a few years back to the MP's expenses scandal. There were claims for the cleaning of a moat, for the fitting of a chandelier, and the best one, for the purchase of a duck house. Now, if those politicians had come to us and they said, it's okay, think of all the good stuff I do for my constituents, well, it wouldn't have made any difference, would it? That would hardly cut it for us in the court of public opinion. That's because we know that good actions don't gloss over the bad. We know that's true in loads of aspects of our lives. And yet somehow it's possible to fall into the trap of thinking that it's different when it comes to faith. Many of us operate with a mindset that good works can somehow put us in the right with God. It's a mindset that this final passage in Haggai is going to expose. He's going to show us something far greater. We're going to learn first from this passage that some good works don't make up for sinful hearts. That's the first thing in this passage. Some good works don't make up for sinful hearts. Haggai speaking his third word from the Lord. Remember, each one is on a specific day. God's speaking to a specific people in a specific place, and not made up stuff, but it's a specific word. 18th of December, 520 BC. It's about 3 months after he spoke to them the first time. And let's listen again, just listen into verses 10 to 12. On the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests what the law says. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? The priests answered, no. Now, it all seems a little strange at first. I get it. Stick with it. The Old Testament priests, they were given a portion of the foods that were brought to them for sacrifice. They could take it home for dinner. And so that's the little picture that Haggai paints here. It's of one of those priests. He's carrying this consecrated, that means set-apart meat, home in his dinner, in his folds of his cloak for his dinner. The question Haggai asks is, does the fold of the garment that the meat's in transfer the meat's holiness to other things that it touches? In other words, does holiness spread? And the priests knew their law. They answered and said, no. Holiness doesn't catch on. Then Haggai asked them another one. Verse 13, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Here the question is the opposite. Does unholiness get transferred? And the priests know the answer to this one too. Yes, it becomes defiled. Sin is contagious. It catches on. So the point Haggai is making is this: holiness doesn't rub off, but sin does. Now, we get this very vividly at the moment, don't we? People with coronavirus, they need to be isolated, quarantined from the rest of us. Why? Because the disease is very contagious. I was in Heathrow Airport this last week, having a look at what the chaplains get up to there. And one of them was taking me around, and they pointed me to an area of gates in Terminal 4. And it's been set aside for flights coming in with people who need to be quarantined. It's this whole area. It's been set up so that you can isolate it from the rest of the airport. We're really grateful for that, aren't we? For all the measures that are in place, because the virus spreads. But it doesn't work the other way around, does it? The rest of us don't pass on our good health to those who are ill. It doesn't work that way. Because good health doesn't spread. Disease does. Why is Haggai saying all this? Verse 14. Then Haggai said, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. He's saying this is a people who are unclean, sinful in the eyes of a holy God. So whatever they do for the construction of the temple, whatever sacrifices they offer, these become defiled, contaminated, tainted. Now we're meant to feel the shock of this, I think. Remember, back in chapter 1, Haggai's called the people to repentance, he's called the people to the rebuilding, and they've got on with the work. And then God's come to them in last week's chapter and he said, when you get discouraged, remember that I'm with you. Remember that the future's glorious. Keep going. But now he says they are defiled. What's the issue? It seems that he's saying that making some sacrifices towards the rebuilding isn't going to make up for disobedience in other areas of their lives. You see, God's not fooled by hypocrisy, because some good works don't make up for sinful hearts. See, in the first chapter, we were challenged by Haggai to consider ways that we might have been saying, not yet, Lord. Ways that we've been putting off things in our obedience to the Lord Jesus. And there's a danger, having been challenged about that, there's a danger that comes in. It's that we might make some superficial changes here and there in our lives, which we then use to excuse other areas of sin. Here are some possible examples how this might work. Maybe there's a person who's been spending their money recklessly. They're trying to buy happiness for themselves through sinful pleasure seeking. They feel guilty about it, so they start to give a little bit of money here and there to church. But giving money doesn't cancel out the reckless spending, does it? It doesn't work that way. There's another person, they serve in a ministry area here in church, and maybe on a Sunday you present yourself as someone who's a deeply committed member. But you know that the rest of the week, your life is lived for yourself, for your comfort. So you double down at church, you work harder, hoping that no one will ask too many questions about the rest of your life. Or you attend koinonia regularly, and you're hoping that that might impress God in some way. But your friends at school, if you're honest, they wouldn't really know that you're a Christian from the way that you behave week to week. You see, some good works don't make up for sinful hearts. And it's a really easy mentality to fall into. We serve the Lord in some way, and then we think to ourselves, we'd never say it out loud, but we think to ourselves, God must be pretty pleased with me now. It's as if we feel that somehow the holiness from the work that we've done has spread to the whole of ourselves, the whole of who we are. But good works can't make us good. Even in our best works, we know there'll be sinful motives at play. When we think about how we've served the Lord, the right response is humility, not pride. This is what Jesus says in Luke chapter 17. He says that when we have done everything we're told to do, we should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. So how do we fall into this mindset? I reckon the reason it's so easy is because it's the way the world around us thinks, isn't it? It's the thinking that goes a bit like this. Maybe you've heard a friend say something like this. I do more good things than bad, so on balance I must be a good person. Or they might say, I say some prayers every day that I learned as a child, so that must count for something. It's the kind of thinking that's all around us. It's in the air we breathe. And so it might be there are some people here this evening who are thinking that way. If that's you, please can I say to you, that's not the way it works. Holiness isn't contagious, but sin is. You see, we're not the fundamentally good people that we like to think we are. The Bible says we're fundamentally sinful people. And so a few good acts here and there can't make up for that. They can't make a person good. Good works can't change sinful hearts. That's why, by the way, trusting in Jesus is so radically different than every other faith. You know, other world religions, in different ways, they teach that certain kinds and certain quantities of good works are necessary if you are to have a hope of salvation. But just think about the logic for a moment. If you take it to its logical conclusion, where does it lead? Well, it leads to despair. You can never know if you've done enough good works to be saved. It's impossible to know. You notice how different faith in Jesus is? We're not going to read them again right now, but if you just glance down at verses 15 to 19, this isn't how God works. You see, if God worked by rewarding good deeds, then we would expect that after the people had started to obey and started to rebuild the temple again in chapter 1, he would start to bless them again. Maybe he'd bless them economically. But look, that's not what's happened. The same economic frustrations that we heard about in chapter 1 are here. The people have been rebuilding now for 3 months, but their living conditions haven't changed at all. But then in verse 19, God suddenly says, "From this day, I will bless you." I think we're meant to see from that God blesses when he chooses to bless. He doesn't bless us because we've done something good and then he pours out a blessing. No, when God blesses, he does it freely to people who don't deserve it. That's so wonderfully liberating when you get it. To get that forgiveness totally undeserved. Nothing you can do to earn it. Just stop trying to make up for a sinful heart by doing a few good things here and there around the edges. It's only ever going to lead to despair. But if you return to Jesus, Will you receive this most liberating of all forgiveness? Stop having to strive. You get this free forgiveness. Some good works don't make up for sinful hearts. And yet God still chooses to bless his people through his chosen king. That's what we're going to see in the final verses of this book. God still blesses his people through his chosen king. Now, all the frustration the people have experienced, remember, they were going through hard times economically. And then when God says, verse 19, from this day on, I'm going to bless you. Maybe they were thinking there's an economic blessing coming, a bumper crop maybe in the harvest to come. But that's not what he promises them here. He promises them something far greater. Later, that same day, we get a second word from the Lord. And we discover more about this blessing. Verse 20. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers, horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. As Haggai was speaking these words, the people, they're in a very weak position. They're short on resources, they're lacking in defenses, and they're largely at the mercy of the massive Persian Empire around them. King Darius is on his throne. They've got no king of their own. And the work they were doing seemed very weak, the hostile powers around them very strong. And into that fragile situation, God speaks these words of comfort. He says, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. We heard a bit about this great shaking last week. The day when God is going to shake the heavens and the earth. Only what is of eternal value will be left over. And when he does that, all the hostile powers, they're going to be shaken away. It's Exodus language. It's language of when God overthrew the Egyptians, the chariots and their drivers in the Red Sea. He brought his people to safety. God's saying, I've done it before. I can and I will do it again for my people. It's a promise. All the hostile powers, everything that sets itself up in opposition to him, that's going to be shaken away. I hope we're going to see this is a wonderful blessing for God's people. Just think for a moment of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who face persecution for their faith. The odds are stacked against them. Those who oppose them appear really powerful, very frightening. But here Haggai is pointing forwards. He's pointing to the day when all God's enemies are going to be taken away, when his people are going to live in perfect peace with him for all eternity. It's an extraordinary blessing from God. God is going to overturn all those hostile powers, none left. And what he's going to do instead, he's going to set up his eternal king on his throne. That's the blessing that verse 23 is talking about. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. Again, the verse seems a little obscure to us at first, but there's gold dust here. Stick with it. Here's the backstory. Zerubbabel, he's the grandson of the last king before the exile, before God's people were taken away by the Babylonians. His grandfather was called Jeconiah. And Jeconiah was a descendant of King David. God had promised to David that his kingdom would last forever. But God's people think that surely those promises have failed when his people are taken into exile. Because in Jeremiah chapter 2, we hear that God's judge Jeconiah, God says, as surely as I live, even if you, Jeconiah, were a signet ring on my hand, I would still pull you off. Now signet rings, they are a sign of the power, the authority of kings. They were stamped. People would stamp them to say, this is my authority, the king's authority. And so the kings in Judah, they were like that. They were like God's representatives, God's authority on earth. But in those verses, God's saying he's taken away that authority from Jeconiah. So it seemed to the people that God's promise to David had been broken. It's a disaster. There's no longer a king on David's throne to rule his people. But here in verse 23, God's saying he's chosen Zerubbabel, and he's going to make him his servant and his signet ring. He's saying that the promise to David hasn't been broken. His kingdom's going to endure. But here's the puzzle. We don't hear anything more about Zerubbabel after this in the Old Testament. Things go silent. We don't hear of him again. He doesn't become king. King Darius of Persia, he continues for another 30 years. So what's going on? Well, the promise to David was a promise to all of his descendants. Do you remember last term, if you were here, we looked at that genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, that family line of Jesus. And guess who appears in it? Well, none other than our wonderfully named Zerubbabel. So this promise from God to Zerubbabel, it's a promise that one day he was going to put his chosen king, his servant, on his throne. It's going to happen on that day, verse 23, on the day that he returns to judge the world. On that day, God is promising that his chosen king is going to rule forever. He's going to bring eternal blessing to his people. You know, we've seen from this little book the ways that we're very much like the people in Haggai's day. We know we have an urgent task to make disciples of King Jesus, but we know that the work seems slow and sometimes insignificant. Sometimes we slow it down by our own disobedience, by saying, "Not yet, Lord," by putting things off. Sometimes it's slowed down by others, by opposition to the gospel, which seems so strong. And so the close of this book is really glorious news. On that day, when Jesus returns, God is saying every knee will bow and every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. All that opposition shaken away. God's people who deserve nothing from him, but who've been forgiven through Jesus' death, they're going to have blessing upon blessing poured upon them as they enjoy the perfect rule of King Jesus. It's a little book, Haggai. I think it packs a big punch. And so as we close our series, I want to give us an opportunity to pray in some of the things that we've heard. That's how we're going to do our prayers this evening. So in a moment, if you feel comfortable, turn in ones and twos. If you'd rather just pray yourself, that's of course fine. But do turn, if you can, to those around you. And it might be that there's some way that you've realized as we've been going through, you've been saying, "Not yet, Lord," something you've been putting off in your Christian life. And you want to commit that to God, and you want to ask for his help to commit yourself to that work, to put him first. Or it might be you've been feeling discouraged by some of the ways that church feels insignificant. The opposition to the gospel seems strong. It might be good to pray that you'd be encouraged to keep going. To keep going by the promise that God is going to shake the heavens and the earth. And when he does, we're going to see that all our efforts have been worth it. We're going to be gathered around his throne. It might be that you want to pray that you would keep going, trusting him, keeping working for him, keeping sharing this good news. So let's just have a few moments of prayer. Turn to those around you, and then Tom will draw us back in after a few minutes.